He smeared on the clay. If only I'd some green. He turned a half-concealed face up to Roger and answered the comprehension of his gaze. For hunting. Like in the war. You know, dazzle paint. Like things trying to look like something else. He twisted in the urgency of telling. Like moths on a tree trunk. Roger understood and nodded gravely. The twins moved towards Jack and began to protest timidly about something. Jack waved them away. Shut up! He rubbed the charcoal stick between the patches of red and white on his face. No, you two come with me. He peered at his reflection and disliked it. He bent down, took up a double handful of lukewarm water, and rubbed the mess from his face. Freckles and sandy eyebrows appeared. Roger smiled unwillingly. You don't half look a mess. Jack planned his new face. He made one cheek and one eye socket white, then rubbed red over the other half of his face, and slashed a black bar of charcoal across from right ear to left jaw. He looked in the mirror for his reflection, but his breathing troubled the mirror. Sam Nerick, get me a coconut, an empty one. He knelt, holding the shell of water. A rounded patch of sunlight fell on his face, and a brightness appeared in the depths of the water. He looked in astonishment, no longer at himself, but at an awesome stranger. He spilt the water and leapt to his feet, laughing excitedly. Beside the mirror, his sinewy body held up a mask that drew their eyes and appalled them. He began to dance, and his laughter became a bloodthirsty snarling. He capered towards Bill, and the mask was the thing on its own behind which Jack hid, liberated from shame and self-consciousness. The face of red and white and black swung through the air and jigged towards Bill. Bill started up, laughing. Then suddenly he fell silent and blundered away through the bushes. Jack rushed towards the twins. The rest are making a line. Come on. But come on. I'll creep up and stab. The mask compelled them. Ralph climbed out of the bathing pool and trotted up the beach and sat in the shade beneath the palms. His fair hair was plastered over his eyebrows, and he pushed it back. Simon was floating in the water and kicking with his feet, and Morris was practising diving. Piggy was mooning about, aimlessly picking up things and discarding them. The rock pools which so fascinated him were covered by the tide, and so he was without an interest until the tide went back. Presently, seeing Ralph under the palms, he came and sat by him. Piggy wore the remainders of a pair of shorts. His fat body was golden brown, and the glasses still flashed when he looked at anything. He was the only boy on the island whose hair never seemed to grow. The rest were shock-headed, but Piggy's hair still lay in wisps over his head, as though baldness were his natural state, and this imperfect covering would soon go, like the velvet on a young stag's antlers. "I've been thinking," he said, "about a clock. We could make a sundial. We could put a stick in the sand, and then—" The effort to express the mathematical processes involved was too great. He made a few passes instead. "And an airplane and a TV set," said Ralph sourly, "and a steam engine." Piggy shook his head. "You have to have a lot of metal things for that," he said, "and we haven't got no metal, but we got a stick." Ralph turned and smiled involuntarily. Piggy was a bore. His fat, his asthma, and his matter-of-fact ideas were dull. But there was always a little pleasure to be got out of pulling his leg, even if one did it by accident. Piggy saw the smile and misinterpreted it as friendliness. There had grown up, tacitly among the big uns, the opinion that Piggy was an outsider, not only by accent, which did not matter, but by fat and asthma and specs, and a certain disinclination for manual labour. Now, finding that something he had said made Ralph smile, he rejoiced, and pressed his advantage. "We got a lot of sticks. We could have a sundial each. Then we should know what the time was." A fat lot of good that would be. Well, you said you wanted things done so as we could be rescued. Oh, shut up. He leapt to his feet and trotted back to the pool, just as Morris did a rather poor dive. Ralph was glad of a chance to change the subject. He shouted as Morris came to the surface, "Belly flop! Belly flop!" Morris flashed a smile at Ralph, who slid easily into the water. Of all the boys, he was the most at home there. But today, irked by the mention of rescue, the useless, footling mention of rescue, even the green depths of water and the shattered golden sun held no balm. Instead of remaining and playing, he swam with steady strokes under Simon and crawled out of the other side of the pool to lie there, sleek and streaming like a seal. Piggy, always clumsy, stood up and came to stand by him, so that Ralph rolled on his stomach and pretended not to see. The mirages had died away, and gloomily he ran his eye along the taut blue line of the horizon. The next moment he was on his feet and shouting, "Smoke! Smoke!" Simon tried to sit up in the water and got a mouthful. Morris, who'd been standing ready to dive, swayed back on his heels, made a bolt for the platform, then swerved back to the grass under the palms. There he started to pull on his tattered shorts, to be ready for anything. Ralph stood, one hand holding back his hair, the other clenched. Simon was climbing out of the water. Piggy was rubbing his glasses on his shorts and squinting at the sea. Morris had got both legs through one leg of his shorts. Of all the boys, only Ralph was still. "I can't see no smoke," said Piggy incredulously. "I can't see no smoke, Ralph. Where is it?" Ralph said nothing. Now both his hands were clenched over his forehead, so that the fair hair was kept out of his eyes. He was leaning forward, and already the salt was whitening his body. "Ralph, where's the ship?" Simon stood by, looking from Ralph to the horizon. Morris's trousers gave way with a sigh, and he abandoned them as a wreck, rushed towards the forest, and then came back again. The smoke was a tight little knot on the horizon, and was uncoiling slowly. Beneath the smoke was a dot that might be a funnel. Ralph's face was pale as he spoke to himself. "They'll see our smoke." Piggy was looking in the right direction now. "It don't look much." He turned round and peered up at the mountain. Ralph continued to watch the ship ravenously. Colour was coming back into his face. Simon stood by him, silent. "I know I can't see very much," said Piggy, "but have we got any smoke?" Ralph moved impatiently, still watching the ship. "The smoke on the mountain?" Morris came running and stared out to sea. Both Simon and Piggy were looking up at the mountain. Piggy screwed up his face, but Simon cried out as though he had hurt himself. "Ralph! Ralph!" The quality of his speech slewed Ralph on the sand. "You tell me," said Piggy anxiously. "Is there a signal?" Ralph looked back at the dispersing smoke on the horizon, then up at the mountain. "Ralph, please! Is there a signal?" Simon put out his hand timidly to touch Ralph. But Ralph started to run, splashing through the shallow end of the bathing pool, across the hot white sand and under the palms. A moment later he was battling with the complex undergrowth that was already engulfing the scar. Simon ran after him, then Morris. Piggy shouted, "Ralph! Please, Ralph!" Then he too started to run, stumbling over Morris's discarded shorts before he was across the terrace. Behind the four boys the smoke moved gently along the horizon, and on the beach Henry and Johnny were throwing sand at Percival, who was crying quietly again, and all three were in complete ignorance of the excitement. By the time Ralph had reached the landward end of the scar, he was using precious breath to swear. He did desperate violence to his naked body among the rasping creepers, so that blood was sliding over him. Just where the steep ascent to the mountain began, he stopped. Morris was only a few yards behind him. "Piggy's specs!" shouted Ralph. "If the fire's right out, we'll need them." He stopped shouting and swayed on his feet. Piggy was only just visible, bumbling up from the beach. Ralph looked at the horizon, then up to the mountain. Was it better to fetch Piggy's glasses, or would the ship have gone? Or, if they climbed on, supposing the fire was right out and they had to watch Piggy crawling nearer and the ship sinking under the horizon? Balanced on a high peak of need, agonized by indecision, Ralph cried out, "Oh, God! Oh, God!" Simon, struggling with bushes, caught his breath. His face was twisted. Ralph blundered on, savaging himself as the wisp of smoke moved on. The fire was dead. They saw that straight away, saw what they had really known down on the beach when the smoke of home had beckoned. The fire was right out, smokeless, and dead. The watchers were gone. A pile of unused fuel lay ready. Ralph turned to the sea. The horizon stretched impersonal once more, barren of all but the faintest trace of smoke. Ralph ran stumbling along the rocks, saved himself on the edge of the pink cliff, and screamed at the ship, "Come back! Come back!" He ran backwards and forwards along the cliff, his face always to the sea, and his voice rose insanely, "Come back! Come back!" Simon and Morris arrived. Ralph looked at them with unwinking eyes. Simon turned away, smearing the water from his cheeks. Ralph reached inside himself for the worst word he knew. "They let the bloody fire out!" He looked down the unfriendly side of the mountain. Piggy arrived out of breath and whimpering like a little one. Ralph clenched his fists and went very red. The intentness of his gaze, the bitterness of his voice pointed for him. "There they are!" A procession had appeared, far down among the pink screes that lay near the water's edge. Some of the boys wore black caps, but otherwise they were almost naked. They lifted sticks in the air together whenever they came to an easy patch. They were chanting, something to do with the bundle that the errant twins carried so carefully. Ralph picked out Jack easily, even at that distance, tall, red-haired, and inevitably leading the procession. Simon looked now from Ralph to Jack, as he had looked from Ralph to the horizon, and what he saw seemed to make him afraid. Ralph said nothing more, but waited while the procession came nearer. The chant was audible, but at that distance still wordless. Behind Jack walked the twins, carrying a great stake on their shoulders. The gutted carcass of a pig swung from the stake, swinging heavily as the twins toiled over the uneven ground. The pig's head hung down with gaping neck, and seemed to search for something on the ground. At last the words of the chant floated up to them, across the bowl of blackened wood and ashes. "Kill the pig! Cut her throat! Spill her blood!" Yet as the words became audible, the procession reached the steepest part of the mountain, and in a minute or two the chant had died away. Piggy snivelled, and Simon shushed him quickly, as though he had spoken too loudly in church. Jack, his face smeared with clays, reached the top first, and hailed Ralph excitedly with lifted spear. "Look! We've killed a pig! We stole up on them! We got in a circle!" Voices broke from the hunters. "We got in a circle! We crept up! The pig squealed!" The twins stood with the pig swinging between them, dropping black gouts on the rock. They seemed to share one wide, ecstatic grin. Jack had too many things to tell Ralph at once. Instead, he danced a step or two, then remembered his dignity, and stood still, grinning. He noticed blood on his hands, and grimaced distastefully, looked for something on which to clean them, then wiped them on his shorts, and laughed. Ralph spoke. "You let the fire out." Jack checked, vaguely irritated by this irrelevance, but too happy to let it worry him. "We can light the fire again. You should have been with us, Ralph. We had a smashing time. The twins got knocked over. We hit the pig. I fell on top. I cut the pig's throat," said Jack, proudly, and yet twitched as he said it. "Can I borrow yours, Ralph, to make a nick in the hilt?" The boys chattered and danced. The twins continued to grin. "There was lashings of blood," said Jack, laughing and shuddering. "You should have seen it. We'll go hunting every day." Ralph spoke again, hoarsely. He had not moved. "You let the fire out." This repetition made Jack uneasy. He looked at the twins and then back at Ralph. "We had to have them in the hunt," he said, "or there wouldn't have been enough for a ring." He flushed, conscious of a fault. "The fire's only been out an hour or two. We can light up again." He noticed Ralph's scarred nakedness, and the sombre silence of all four of them. He sought, charitable in his happiness, to include them in the thing that had happened. His mind was crowded with memories of the knowledge that had come to them when they closed in on the struggling pig, knowledge that they had outwitted a living thing, imposed their will upon it, taken away its life, like a long, satisfying drink. He spread his arms wide. "You should have seen the blood." The hunters were more silent now, but at this they buzzed again. Ralph flung back his hair. One arm pointed at the empty horizon. His voice was loud and savage, and struck them into silence. "There was a ship!" End of Disc 2. Lord of the Flies, Disc 3. Jack, faced at once with too many awful implications, ducked away from them. He laid a hand on the pig and drew his knife. Ralph brought his arm down, fist clenched, and his voice shook. "There was a ship out there. You said you'd keep the fire going, and you let it out." He took a step towards Jack, who turned and faced him. "They might have seen us. We might have gone home." This was too bitter for Piggy, who forgot his timidity in the agony of his loss. He began to cry out shrilly, "You and your blood, Jack married you! You and your hunting! We might have gone home!" Ralph pushed Piggy on one side. "I was chief, and you were going to do what I said. You talk, but you can't even build huts. Then you go off hunting and let out the fire." He turned away, silent for a moment. Then his voice came again on a peak of feeling. "There was a ship!" One of the smaller hunters began to wail. The dismal truth was filtering through to everybody. Jack went very red as he hacked and pulled at the pig. "The job was too much. We needed everyone." Ralph turned. "You could have had everyone when the shelters were finished. But you had to hunt. We needed meat." Jack stood up as he said this, the bloodied knife in his hand. The two boys faced each other. There was the brilliant world of hunting, tactics, fierce exhilaration, skill, and there was the world of longing and baffled common sense. Jack transferred the knife to his left hand and smudged blood over his forehead as he pushed down the plastered hair. Piggy began again. "You didn't ought to have let that fire out. You said you'd keep the smoke going." This from Piggy, and the wails of agreement from some of the hunters, drove Jack to violence. The bolting look came into his blue eyes. He took a step, and, able at last to hit someone, stuck his fist into Piggy's stomach. Piggy sat down with a grunt. Jack stood over him. His voice was vicious with humiliation. "You would you, fatty?" Ralph made a step forward, and Jack smacked Piggy's head. Piggy's glasses flew off and tinkled on the rocks. Piggy cried out in terror, "My specs!" He went crouching and feeling over the rocks, but Simon, who got there first, found them for him. Passions beat about Simon on the mountain top with awful wings. "One side's broken." Piggy grabbed and put on the glasses. He looked malevolently at Jack.
"I gotta have them specs. Now I only got one eye. Just you wait."
Jack made a move towards Piggy, who scrambled away till a great rock lay between them. He thrust his head over the top and glared at Jack through his one flashing glass.
"Now I only got one eye. Just you wait."
Jack mimicked the whine and scramble.
"Just you wait, yah!"
Piggy and the parody was so funny that the hunters began to laugh. Jack felt encouraged. He went on scrambling, and the laughter rose to a gale of hysteria. Unwillingly, Ralph felt his lips twitch. He was angry with himself for giving way. He muttered, "That was a dirty trick." Jack broke out of his gyration and stood facing Ralph. His words came in a shout. "All right, all right." He looked at Piggy, at the hunters, at Ralph. "I'm sorry. About the fire, I mean. There. He drew himself up. "I apologize." The buzz from the hunters was one of admiration at this handsome behaviour. Clearly they were of the opinion that Jack had done the right thing, had put himself in the right by his generous apology, and Ralph, obscurely, in the wrong. They waited for an appropriately decent answer. Yet Ralph's throat refused to pass one. He resented, as an addition to Jack's misbehaviour, this verbal trick. The fire was dead. The ship was gone. Could they not see? Anger instead of decency passed his throat. That was a dirty trick. They were silent on the mountain-top, while the opaque look appeared in Jack's eyes, and passed away. Ralph's final word was an ungracious mutter. "All right. Light the fire." With some positive action before them, a little of the tension died. Ralph said no more, did nothing, stood looking down at the ashes round his feet. Jack was loud and active. He gave orders, sang, whistled, threw remarks at the silent Ralph, remarks that did not need an answer, and therefore could not invite a snub. And still Ralph was silent. No one, not even Jack, would ask him to move, and in the end they had to build the fire 3 yards away, and in a place not really as convenient. So Ralph asserted his chieftainship, and could not have chosen a better way if he had thought for days. Against this weapon, so indefinable and so effective, Jack was powerless, and raged without knowing why. By the time the pile was built, they were on different sides of a high barrier. When they had dealt with the fire, another crisis arose. Jack had no means of lighting it. Then, to his surprise, Ralph went to Piggy and took the glasses from him. Not even Ralph knew how a link between him and Jack had been snapped and fastened elsewhere. "I'll bring them back."
"I'll come too."
Piggy stood behind him, islanded in a sea of meaningless colour, while Ralph knelt and focused the glossy spot. Instantly the fire was alight. Piggy held out his hand and grabbed the glasses back. Before these fantastically attractive flowers of violet and red and yellow, unkindness melted away. They became a circle of boys round a campfire, and even Piggy and Ralph were half drawn in. Soon some of the boys were rushing down the slope for more wood, while Jack hacked the pig. They tried holding the whole carcass on a stake over the fire, but the stake burnt more quickly than the pig roasted. In the end they skewered bits of meat on branches, and held them in the flames, and even then almost as much boy was roasted as meat. Ralph dribbled. He meant to refuse meat, but his past diet of fruit and nuts, with an odd crab or fish, gave him too little resistance. He accepted a piece of half-raw meat, and gnawed it like a wolf. Piggy spoke, almost dribbling.
"Aren't I having none?"
Jack had meant to leave him in doubt, as an assertion of power, but Piggy, by advertising this omission, made more cruelty necessary. "You didn't hunt."
"No more did Ralph,"
said Piggy wetly.
"Nor Simon."
He amplified.
"There isn't more than a ha'porth of meat in a crab."
Ralph stirred uneasily. Simon, sitting between the twins and Piggy, wiped his mouth and shoved his piece of meat over the rocks to Piggy, who grabbed it. The twins giggled, and Simon lowered his face in shame. Then Jack leapt to his feet, slashed off a great hunk of meat, and flung it down at Simon's feet.
"Eat, damn you!"
He glared at Simon.
"Take it!"
He spun on his heel, centre of a bewildered circle of boys.
"I got you meat!"
Numberless and inexpressible frustrations combined to make his rage elemental and awe-inspiring.
"I painted my face. I stole up. Now you eat, all of you. And I—"
Slowly the silence on the mountain-top deepened, till the click of the fire and the soft hiss of roasting meat could be heard clearly. Jack looked round for understanding, but found only respect. Ralph stood among the ashes of the signal fire, his hands full of meat, saying nothing. Then, at last, Morris broke the silence. He changed the subject to the only one that could bring the majority of them together. "Where did you find the pig?" Roger pointed down the unfriendly side. "They were there, by the sea." Jack, recovering, could not bear to have his story told. He broke in quickly. "We spread round. I crept on hands and knees. The spears fell out because they hadn't barbs on. The pig ran away and made an awful noise. It turned back and ran into the circle, bleeding." All the boys were talking at once, relieved and excited. "We closed in." The first blow had paralyzed its hindquarters, so then the circle could close in and beat and beat.
"I cut the pig's throat."
The twins, still sharing their identical grin, jumped up and ran round each other. Then the rest joined in, making pig-dying noises and shouting,
"One for his knob! Give him a 41!"
Then Morris pretended to be the pig and ran squealing into the centre, and the hunters, circling still, pretended to beat him. As they danced, they sang, "Kill the pig! Cut her throat! Bash her in!" Ralph watched them, envious and resentful. Not till they flagged, and the chant died away, did he speak. "I'm calling an assembly." One by one they halted, and stood watching him. "With the conch. I'm calling a meeting, even if we have to go on into the dark, down on the platform, when I blow it. Now." He turned away and walked off, down the mountain. Chapter 5. Beast from Water. The tide was coming in, and there was only a narrow strip of firm beach between the water and the white stumbling stuff near the palm terrace. Ralph chose the firm strip as a path because he needed to think, and only here could he allow his feet to move without having to watch them. Suddenly, pacing by the water, he was overcome with astonishment. He found himself understanding the wearisomeness of this life, where every path was an improvisation, and a considerable part of one's waking life was spent watching one's feet. He stopped, facing the strip, and remembering that first enthusiastic exploration as though it were part of a brighter childhood, he smiled jeeringly. He turned then and walked back towards the platform with the sun in his face. The time had come for the assembly, and as he walked into the concealing splendours of the sunlight, he went carefully over the points of his speech. There must be no mistake about this assembly, no chasing imaginary. He lost himself in a maze of thoughts that were rendered vague by his lack of words to express them. Frowning, he tried again. This meeting must not be fun, but business. At that he walked faster, aware all at once of urgency and the declining sun, and a little wind created by his speed that breathed about his face. This wind pressed his grey shirt against his chest, so that he noticed, in this new mood of comprehension, how the folds were stiff like cardboard, and unpleasant. Noticed, too, how the frayed edges of his shorts were making an uncomfortable pink area on the front of his thighs. With a convulsion of the mind, Ralph discovered dirt and decay, understood how much he disliked perpetually flicking the tangled hair out of his eyes, and, at last, when the sun was gone, rolling noisily to rest among dry leaves. At that he began to trot. The beach near the bathing pool was dotted with groups of boys waiting for the assembly. They made way for him silently, conscious of his grim mood and the fault at the fire. The place of assembly in which he stood was roughly a triangle, but irregular and sketchy, like everything they made. First there was the log on which he himself sat, a dead tree that must have been quite exceptionally big for the platform. Perhaps one of those legendary storms of the Pacific had shifted it here. This palm trunk lay parallel to the beach, so that when Ralph sat he faced the island, but to the boys was a darkish figure against the shimmer of the lagoon. The two sides of the triangle, of which the log was base, were less evenly defined. On the right was a log polished by restless seats along the top, but not so large as the chief's, and not so comfortable. On the left were 4 small logs, one of them, the furthest, lamentably springy. Assembly after assembly had broken up in laughter when someone had leaned too far back, and the log had whipped and thrown half a dozen boys backwards into the grass. Yet now, he saw, no one had the wit, not himself, nor Jack, nor Piggy, to bring a stone and wedge the thing. So they would continue enduring the ill-balanced twister because... Again he lost himself in deep waters. Grass was worn away in front of each trunk, but grew tall and untrodden in the centre of the triangle. Then at the apex the grass was thick again because no one sat there. All round the place of assembly the grey trunks rose, straight or leaning, and supported the low roof of leaves. On 2 sides was the beach, behind the lagoon, in front the darkness of the island. Ralph turned to the chief's seat. They had never had an assembly as late before. That was why the place looked so different. Normally the underside of the green roof was lit by a tangle of golden reflections, and their faces were lit upside down, like, thought Ralph, when you hold an electric torch in your hands. But now the sun was slanting in at one side, so that the shadows were where they ought to be. Again he fell into that strange mood of speculation that was so foreign to him. If faces were different when lit from above or below, what was a face? What was anything? Ralph moved impatiently. The trouble was, if you were a chief, you had to think, you had to be wise. And then the occasion slipped by so that you had to grab at a decision. This made you think, because thought was a valuable thing that got results. Only, decided Ralph as he faced the chief's seat, I can't think. Not like Piggy. Once more that evening Ralph had to adjust his values. Piggy could think. He could go step by step inside that fat head of his, only Piggy was no chief. But Piggy, for all his ludicrous body, had brains. Ralph was a specialist in thought now, and could recognize thought in another. The sun in his eyes reminded him how time was passing, so he took the conch down from the tree and examined the surface. Exposure to the air had bleached the yellow and pink to near white and transparency. Ralph felt a kind of affectionate reverence for the conch, even though he had fished the thing out of the lagoon himself. He faced the place of assembly and put the conch to his lips. The others were waiting for this and came straight away. Those who were aware that a ship had passed the island while the fire was out were subdued by the thought of Ralph's anger, while those, including the little ones who did not know, were impressed by the general air of solemnity. The place of assembly filled quickly. Jack, Simon, Morris, most of the hunters on Ralph's right, the rest on the left, under the sun. Piggy came and stood outside the triangle. This indicated that he wished to listen but would not speak, and Piggy intended it as a gesture of disapproval. "The thing is, we need an assembly." No one said anything, but the faces turned to Ralph were intent. He flourished the conch. He had learned, as a practical business, that fundamental statements like this had to be said at least twice before everyone understood them. One had to sit attracting all eyes to the conch and drop words like heavy round stones among the little groups that crouched or squatted. He was searching his mind for simple words, so that even the little ones would understand what the assembly was about. Later, perhaps, practised debaters, Jack, Morris, Piggy, would use their whole art to twist the meeting. But now, at the beginning, the subject of the debate must be laid out clearly. "We need an assembly. Not for fun, not for laughing and falling off the log." The group of little uns on the twister giggled and looked at each other. "Not for making jokes or for—" He lifted the conch in an effort to find the compelling word. "For cleverness. Not for these things, but to put things straight." He paused for a moment. "I've been along. By myself I went, thinking what's what. I know what we need. An assembly to put things straight, and first of all, I'm speaking." He paused for a moment and automatically pushed back his hair. Piggy tiptoed to the triangle, his ineffectual protest made, and joined the others. Ralph went on. "We have lots of assemblies. Everybody enjoys speaking and being together. We decide things, but they don't get done. We were going to have water brought from the stream and left in those coconut shells under fresh leaves. So it was for a few days. Now there's no water. The shells are dry. People drink from the river." There was a murmur of assent. "Not that there's anything wrong with drinking from the river. I mean, I'd sooner have water from that place, you know, the pool where the waterfall is, than out of an old coconut shell. Only we said we'd have the water brought, and now not. There were only 2 full shells there this afternoon." He licked his lips. "Then there's huts, shelters." The murmur swelled again and died away. "You mostly sleep in shelters. Tonight, except for Sam Nerick up by the fire, you'll all sleep there. Who built the shelters?" Clamour rose at once. Everyone had built the shelters. Ralph had to wave the conch once more. "Wait a minute. I mean, who built all 3? We all built the first one, 4 of us the second, and me and Simon built the last one over there. That's why it's so tottery. No, don't laugh. That shelter might fall down if the rain comes back. We'll need those shelters then." He paused and cleared his throat. "There's another thing. We chose those rocks right along beyond the bathing pool as a lavatory. That was sensible too. The tide cleans the place up. You little uns know about that." There were sniggers here and there, and swift glances. "Now people seem to use everywhere, even near the shelters and the platforms. You little uns, when you're getting fruit, if you're taken short—" The assembly roared. "I said, if you're taken short, you keep away from the fruit. That's dirty." Laughter rose again. "I said, that's dirty." He plucked at his stiff grey shirt. "That's really dirty. If you're taken short, you go right along the beach to the rocks. See?" Piggy held out his hands for the conch, but Ralph shook his head. This speech was planned point by point. "We've all got to use the rocks again. This place is getting dirty." He paused. The assembly, sensing a crisis, was tensely expectant. "And then, about the fire." Ralph let out his spare breath with a little gasp that was echoed by his audience. Jack started to chip a piece of wood with his knife, and whispered something to Robert, who looked away. "The fire is the most important thing on the island. How can we ever be rescued except by luck if we don't keep a fire going? Is a fire too much for us to make?" He flung out an arm. "Look at us! How many are we? And yet we can't keep a fire going to make smoke. Don't you understand? Can't you see we ought to...
or to die before we let the fire out."
There was a self-conscious giggling among the hunters.
Ralph turned on them passionately. "You hunters, you can laugh, but I tell you smoke is more important than the pig, however often you kill one. Do all of you see?"
He spread his arms wide and turned to the whole triangle.
"We've got to make smoke up there, or die."
He paused, feeling for his next point.
"And another thing."
Someone called out,
"Too many things."
There came mutters of agreement. Ralph overrode them.
"And another thing. We nearly set the whole island on fire, and we waste time rolling rocks and making little cooking fires. Now, I say this and make it a rule because I'm chief. We won't have a fire anywhere but on the mountain. Ever."
There was a row immediately.
Boys stood up and shouted, and Ralph shouted back, "Because if you want a fire to cook fish or crab, you can jolly well go up the mountain. That way we'll be certain."
Hands were reaching for the conch in the light of the setting sun. He held on and leapt on the trunk.
"All this I meant to say. Now I've said it. You voted me for chief. Now you do what I say."
They quietened slowly, and at last were seated again. Ralph dropped down and spoke in his ordinary voice. "So remember, the rock's for a lavatory. Keep the fire going and smoke showing a signal. Don't take fire from the mountain. Take your food up there." Jack stood up, scowling in the gloom, and held out his hands.
"I haven't finished yet. But you've talked and talked. I've got the conch."
Jack sat down, grumbling. "Then the last thing. This is what people can talk about." He waited till the platform was very still. "Things are breaking up. I don't understand why. We began well. We were happy. And then—" He moved the conch gently, looking beyond them at nothing, remembering the beastie, the snake, the fire, the talk of fear. Then people started getting frightened. A murmur, almost a moan, rose and passed away. Jack had stopped whittling. Ralph went on abruptly.
"But that's Littland's talk. We'll get that straight. So the last part, the bit we can all talk about, is kind of deciding on the fear."
The hair was creeping into his eyes again.
"We've got to talk about this fear and decide there's nothing in it. I'm frightened myself sometimes, only that's nonsense, like bogies. Then, when we've decided, we can start again and be careful about things like fire."
A picture of 3 boys walking along the bright beach flitted through his mind.
"And be happy."
Ceremonially, Ralph laid the conch on the trunk beside him, as a sign that the speech was over. What sunlight reached them was level. Jack stood up and took the conch.
"So this is a meeting to find out what's what. I'll tell you what's what. You Littlands started all this with the fear talk. Beasts. Where from? Of course we're frightened sometimes, but we put up with being frightened. Only Ralph says you scream in the night. What does that mean but nightmares? Anyway, you don't hunt or build or help. You're a lot of crybabies and sissies, that's what. And as for the fear, you'll have to put up with that like the rest of us."
Ralph looked at Jack open-mouthed, but Jack took no notice.
"The thing is, fear can't hurt you any more than a dream. There aren't any beasts to be afraid of on this island."
He looked along the row of whispering Littlands.
"Serve you right if something did get you, you useless lot of crybabies. But there is no animal."
Ralph interrupted him testily. "What is all this? Who said anything about an animal?"
"You did the other day. You said they dream and cry out. Now they talk, not only the Littlands, but my hunters sometimes. Talk of a thing, a dark thing, a beast, some sort of animal. I've heard. You thought not, didn't you? Now listen. You don't get big animals on small islands, only pigs. You only get lions and tigers in big countries like Africa and India, and the zoo. I've got the conch. I'm not talking about the fear. I'm talking about the beast. Be frightened if you like. But as for the beast—"
Jack paused, cradling the conch, and turned to his hunters with their dirty black caps.
"Am I a hunter, or am I not?"
They nodded, simply. He was a hunter, all right, no one doubted that.
"Well, then, I've been all over this island by myself. If there were a beast, I'd have seen it. Be frightened because you're like that, but there is no beast in the forest."
Jack handed back the conch and sat down. The whole assembly applauded him with relief. Then Piggy held out his hand.
"I don't agree with all Jack said, but with some. Course there isn't a beast in the forest. How could there be? What would a beast eat? Pig. We eat pig. Piggy! Piggy! I got the conch," said Piggy indignantly. "Ralph, they ought to shut up, oughtn't they? You shut up, you little uns. What I mean is that I don't agree about this here fear. Of course there isn't nothing to be afraid of in the forest. Why, I've been there myself. You'll be talking about ghosts and such things next. We know what goes on, and if there's something wrong, there's someone to put it right."
He took off his glasses and blinked at them. The sun had gone as if the light had been turned off. He proceeded to explain.
"If you get a pain in your stomach, whether it's a little one or a big one— yours is a big one— when you've done laughing, perhaps we can get on with the meeting. And if them little uns climb back on the twister again, they'll only fall off in a sec, so they might as well sit on the ground and listen. No, you have doctors for everything, even the inside of your mind. You don't really mean that we got to be frightened all the time of nothing? Life," said Piggy expansively, "is scientific. That's what it is. In a year or two, when the war's over, they'll be travelling to Mars and back. I know there isn't no beast, not with claws and all that, I mean. But I know there isn't no fear, either."
Piggy paused.
"Unless—"
Ralph moved restlessly. "Unless what?"
"Unless we get frightened of people."
A sound, half laugh, half jeer, rose among the seated boys. Piggy ducked his head and went on hastily.
"So let's hear from the little un who talked about a beast, and perhaps we can show him how silly he is."
The little uns began to jabber among themselves. Then one stood forward.
"What's your name?"
"Phil." For a little un he was self-confident, holding out his hands, cradling the conch as Ralph did, looking round at them to collect their attention before he spoke. "Last night I had a dream. A horrid dream, fighting with things. I was outside the shelter by myself, fighting with things, those twisty things in the trees." He paused, and the little uns laughed in horrified sympathy. "Then I was frightened, and I woke up, and I was outside the shelter by myself in the dark, and the twisty things had gone away." The vivid horror of this, so possible and so nakedly terrifying, held them all silent. The child's voice went piping on from behind the white conch. "And I was frightened, and started to call out for Ralph. And then I saw something moving among the trees, something big and horrid." He paused, half frightened by the recollection, yet proud of the sensation he was creating. "That was a nightmare," said Ralph. "He was walking in his sleep." The assembly murmured in subdued agreement. The little un shook his head stubbornly. "I was asleep when the twisty things were fighting, and when they went away I was awake, and I saw something big and horrid moving in the trees." Ralph held out his hands for the conch, and the little un sat down. "You were asleep. There wasn't anyone there. How could anyone be wandering about in the forest at night? Was anyone? Did anyone go out?" There was a long pause, while the assembly grinned at the thought of anyone going out in the darkness. Then Simon stood up, and Ralph looked at him in astonishment. "You? What were you mucking about in the dark for?" Simon grabbed the conch convulsively. "I wanted to go to a place I know." "What place?" "Just a place I know. A place in the jungle." He hesitated. Jack settled the question for them with that contempt in his voice that could sound so funny and so final. He was taken short, with a feeling of humiliation on Simon's behalf. Ralph took back the conch, looking Simon sternly in the face as he did so. "Well, don't do it again. Understand? Not at night. There's enough silly talk about beasts without the little uns seeing you gliding about like a—" The derisive laughter that rose had fear in it and condemnation. Simon opened his mouth to speak, but Ralph had the conch, so he backed to his seat. When the assembly was silent, Ralph turned to Piggy. "Well, Piggy?"
There was another one. Him.
The little uns pushed Percival forward, then left him by himself. He stood knee-deep in the central grass, looking at his hidden feet, trying to pretend he was in a tent. Ralph remembered another small boy who had stood like this, and he flinched away from the memory. He had pushed the thought down and out of sight, where only some positive reminder like this could bring it to the surface. There had been no further numberings of the little uns, partly because there was no means of ensuring that all of them were accounted for, and partly because Ralph knew the answer to at least one question Piggy had asked on the mountain-top. There were little boys, fair, dark, freckled, and all dirty, but their faces were all dreadfully free of major blemishes. No one had seen the mulberry-coloured birthmark again. But that time Piggy had coaxed and bullied. Tacitly admitting that he remembered the unmentionable, Ralph nodded to Piggy. "Go on. Ask him." Piggy knelt, holding the conch.
"Now then, what's your name?"
The small boy twisted away into his tent. Piggy turned helplessly to Ralph, who spoke sharply. "What's your name?" Tormented by the silence and the refusal, the assembly broke into a chant. "What's your name? What's your name? Quiet!" Ralph peered at the child in the twilight. "Now tell us, what's your name?"
"Percival Weems Madison. The vicarage, Harcourt St. Anthony, Hants. Telephone.
As if this information was rooted far down in the springs of sorrow, the little un wept. His face puckered, the tears leapt from his eyes, his mouth opened till they could see a square black hole. At first he was a silent effigy of sorrow, but then the lamentation rose out of him, loud and sustained as the conch. "Shut up, you! Shut up!" Percival Weems Madison would not shut up. A spring had been tapped, far beyond the reach of authority, or even physical intimidation. The crying went on, breath after breath, and seemed to sustain him upright, as if he were nailed to it. "Shut up! Shut up!" For now the little uns were no longer silent. They were reminded of their personal sorrows, and perhaps felt themselves to share in a sorrow that was universal. They began to cry in sympathy, two of them almost as loud as Percival. Morris saved them. He cried out, "Look at me!" He pretended to fall over. He rubbed his rump and sat on the twister so that he fell in the grass. He clowned badly, but Percival and the others noticed and sniffed and laughed. Presently they were all laughing so absurdly that the big uns joined in. Jack was the first to make himself heard. He had not got the conch and thus spoke against the rules, but nobody minded. "And what about the beast?" Something strange was happening to Percival. He yawned and staggered, so that Jack seized and shook him. "Where does the beast live?" Percival sagged in Jack's grip.
"That's a clever beast," said Piggy, jeering. "If it can hide on this island. Jack's been everywhere. Where could a beast live? Beast, my foot."
Percival muttered something, and the assembly laughed again. Ralph leaned forward. "What does he say?" Jack listened to Percival's answer, and then let go of him. Percival, released, surrounded by the comfortable presence of humans, fell in the long grass and went to sleep. Jack cleared his throat, then reported casually, "He says the beast comes out of the sea." The last laugh died away. Ralph turned involuntarily, a black, humped figure against the lagoon. The assembly looked with him, considered the vast stretches of water, the high sea beyond, unknown indigo of infinite possibility, heard silently the sough and whisper from the reef. Morris spoke, so loudly that they jumped. "Daddy says they haven't found all the animals in the sea yet." Argument started again. Ralph held out the glimmering conch, and Morris took it obediently. The meeting subsided. "I mean, when Jack says you can be frightened because people are frightened anyway, that's all right. But when he says there's only pigs on this island, I expect he's right, but he doesn't know. Not really, not certainly, I mean." Morris took a breath. "My daddy says there's things, what do you call 'em, that make ink, squids, that are hundreds of yards long and eat whales whole." He paused again and laughed gaily. "I don't believe in the beast, of course. As Piggy says, life's scientific, but we don't know, do we? Not certainly, I mean." Someone shouted, "A squid couldn't come up out of the water. Couldn't!" In a moment the platform was full of arguing, gesticulating shadows. To Ralph, seated, this seemed the breaking up of sanity. Fear, beasts, no general agreement that the fire was all-important. And when one tried to get the thing straight, the argument sheared off, bringing up fresh, unpleasant matter. He could see a whiteness in the gloom near him, so he grabbed it from Morris and blew as loudly as he could. The assembly was shocked into silence. Simon was close to him, laying hands on the conch. Simon felt a perilous necessity to speak, but to speak in assembly was a terrible thing to him. "Maybe," he said hesitantly, "maybe there is a beast." The assembly cried out savagely, and Ralph stood up in amazement. "You, Simon? You believe in this?" "I don't know," said Simon. His heartbeats were choking him. "But—" The storm broke. "Sit down! Shut up! Take the conch! Sod you! Shut up!" Ralph shouted. "Hear him! He's got the conch!" "What I mean is, maybe it's only us." "Nuts!" That was from Piggy, shocked out of decorum. Simon went on. "We could be sort of—" Simon became inarticulate in his effort to express mankind's essential illness. Inspiration came to him. "What's the dirtiest thing there is?" As an answer, Jack dropped into the uncomprehending silence that followed it, the one crude expressive syllable. Release was like an orgasm. Those little uns who had climbed back on the twister fell off again and did not mind. The hunters were screaming with delight. Simon's effort fell about him in ruins. The laughter beat him cruelly, and he shrank away, defenceless, to his seat. At last the assembly was silent again. Someone spoke out of turn. "Maybe he means it's some sort of ghost." Ralph lifted the conch and peered into the gloom. The lightest thing was the pale beach. Surely the little uns were nearer. Yes, there was no doubt about it. They were huddled into a tight knot of bodies in the central grass. A flurry of wind made the palms talk, and the noise seemed very loud, now that darkness and silence made it so noticeable. Two grey trunks rubbed each other with an evil squeaking that no one had noticed by day. Piggy took the conch out of his hands. His voice was indignant. "I don't believe in no ghosts, ever." Jack was up too, unaccountably angry. "Who cares what you believe, fatty? I got the conch." There was the sound of a brief tussle, and the conch moved to and fro. "You give me the conch back!" Ralph pushed between them and got a thump on the chest. He wrested the conch from someone and sat down breathlessly. "There's too much talk about ghosts. We ought to have left all this for daylight." A hushed and anonymous voice broke in. "Perhaps that's what the beast is. A ghost." The assembly was shaken as by a wind. "There's too much talking out of turn," Ralph said, "because we can't have proper assemblies if you don't stick to the rules." He stopped again. The careful plan of this assembly had broken down. "What do you want me to say, then?" "I was wrong to call this assembly so late. We'll have to vote on them. On ghosts, I mean. And then go to the shelters because we're all tired. No, Jack, is it? Wait a minute. I'll say here and now that I don't believe in ghosts, or I don't think I do. But I don't like the thought of them. Not now, that is, in the dark. But we were going to decide what's what." He raised the conch for a moment. "Very well, then. I suppose what's what is whether there are ghosts or not." He thought for a moment, formulating the question. "Who thinks there may be ghosts?" For a long time there was silence, and no apparent movement. Then Ralph peered into the gloom and made out the hands. He spoke flatly. "I see." The world, that understandable and lawful world, was slipping away. Once there was this and that, and now. And the ship had gone. The conch was snatched from his hands, and Piggy's voice shrilled, "I didn't vote for no ghosts!" He whirled round on the assembly. "Remember that, all of you!" They heard him stamp. "What are we, humans? Or animals? Or savages? What's grown-ups going to think? Going off, hunting pigs, letting fires out. And now—" A shadow fronted him tempestuously. "You shut up, you fat slug!" There was a moment's struggle, and the glimmering conch jigged up and down. Ralph leapt to his feet. "Jack! Jack, you haven't got the conch! Let him speak!" Jack's face swam near him. "And you shut up! Who are you, anyway, sitting there telling people what to do? You can't hunt, you can't sing." "I'm chief. I was chosen." "Why should choosing make any difference? Just giving orders that don't make any sense. Piggy's got the conch. That's right, favour Piggy, as you always do. Jack!" Jack's voice sounded in bitter mimicry. "Jack! Jack! The rules!" shouted Ralph. "You're breaking the rules. Who cares?" Ralph summoned his wits. "Because the rules are the only thing we've got." But Jack was shouting against him. "Bollocks to the rules! We're strong, we hunt. If there's a beast, we'll hunt it down. We'll close in and beat and beat and beat." He gave a wild whoop and leapt down to the pale sand. At once the platform was full of noise and excitement, scramblings, screams, and laughter. The assembly shredded away and became a discursive and random scatter from the palms to the water and away along the beach beyond night sight. Ralph found his cheek touching the conch and took it from Piggy. "What's grown-ups going to say?" cried Piggy again. "Look at 'em!" The sound of mock hunting, hysterical laughter, and real terror came from the beach. "Blow the conch, Ralph!" Piggy was so close that Ralph could see the glint of his one glass. "There's the fire. Can't they see?" "You've got to be tough now. Make 'em do what you want." Ralph answered in the cautious voice of one who rehearses a theorem. "If I blow the conch and they don't come back, then we've had it. We shan't keep the fire going. We'll be like animals. We'll never be rescued." "If you don't blow, we'll soon be animals anyway. I can't see what they're doing, but I can hear." The dispersed figures had come together on the sand, and were a dense black mass that revolved. They were chanting something, and little uns that had had enough were staggering away, howling. Ralph raised the conch to his lips, and then lowered it. "The trouble is, are there ghosts, Piggy? Or beasts?" "Course there aren't." "Why not?" "'Cause things wouldn't make sense. Houses and streets and TV. They wouldn't work." The dancing, chanting boys had worked themselves away, till their sound was nothing but a wordless rhythm. "But suppose they don't make sense? Not here, on this island. Supposing things are watching us, and waiting." Ralph shuddered violently and moved closer to Piggy, so that they bumped frighteningly. "You stop talking like that. We got enough trouble, Ralph, and I've had as much as I can stand. If there is ghosts—" "I ought to give up being chief. Hear 'em." "Oh, Lord! Oh, no!" Piggy gripped Ralph's arm.
If Jack was chief, he'd have all hunting and no fire. We'd be here till we died. His voice ran up to a squeak. Who's that sitting there?
Me, Simon. Fat lot of good we are, said Ralph. 3 blind mice. I'll give up.
If you give up, said Piggy in an appalled whisper, what'd happen to me?
Nothing.
He hates me. I don't know why. If he could do what he wanted, you're all right, he respects you. Besides, you'd hit him.
You were having a nice fight with him just now.
I had the conch, said Piggy simply. I had a right to speak.
Simon stirred in the dark. Go on being chief. You shut up, young Simon. Why couldn't you say there wasn't a beast?
I'm scared of him, said Piggy, and that's why I know him. If you're scared of someone, you hate him, but you can't stop thinking about him. You kid yourself he's all right, really, and then when you see him again, it's like asthma, and you can't breathe. I tell you what, he hates you too, Ralph.
Me? Why me?
I don't know. You got him over the fire, and you're chief and he isn't.
But he's Jack married you.
I been in bed so much I done some thinking. I know about people. I know about me and him. He can't hurt you, but if you stand out of the way, he'd hurt the next thing, and that's me.
Piggy's right, Ralph. There's you and Jack. Go on being chief. We're all drifting, and things are going rotten. At home there was always a grown-up, please, sir, please, miss, and then you've got an answer.
How I wish my auntie was here.
I wish my father. Oh, what's the use? Keep the fire going. The dance was over, and the hunters were going back to the shelters.
Grown-ups know things, said Piggy. They ain't afraid of the dark. They'd meet and have tea and discuss. Then things'll be all right.
They wouldn't set fire to the island, or lose. They'd build a ship. The 3 boys stood in the darkness, striving unsuccessfully to convey the majesty of adult life. They wouldn't quarrel.
Or break my specs.
Or talk about a beast.
If only they could get a message to us, cried Ralph desperately. If only they could send us something grown up, a sign or something.
A thin wail out of the darkness chilled them and set them grabbing for each other. Then the wail rose, remote and unearthly, and turned to an inarticulate gibbering. Percival Weems Madison, of the vicarage, Harcourt St. Anthony, lying in the long grass, was living through circumstances in which the incantation of his address was powerless to help him. Chapter 6. Beast from Air. There was no light left save that of the stars. When they had understood what made this ghostly noise, and Percival was quiet again, Ralph and Simon picked him up unhandily and carried him to a shelter. Piggy hung about near for all his brave words, and the 3 bigger boys went together to the next shelter. They lay restlessly and noisily among the dry leaves, watching the patch of stars that was opening towards the lagoon. Sometimes a little un cried out from the other shelters, and once a big un spoke in the dark. Then they too fell asleep. A sliver of moon rose over the horizon, hardly large enough to make a path of light, even when it sat right down on the water. But there were other lights in the sky that moved fast, winked, or went out, though not even a faint popping came down from the battle fought at 10 miles height. But a sign came down from the world of grown-ups, though at the time there was no child awake to read it. There was a sudden bright explosion, and a corkscrew trail across the sky, then darkness again, and stars. There was a speck above the island, a figure dropping swiftly beneath a parachute, a figure that hung with dangling limbs. The changing winds of various altitudes took the figure where they would, Then, 3 miles up, the wind steadied and bore it in a descending curve round the sky and swept it in a great slant across the reef and the lagoon towards the mountain. The figure fell and crumpled among the blue flowers of the mountainside. But now there was a gentle breeze at this height too, and the parachute flopped and banged and pulled. So the figure, with feet that dragged behind it, slid up the mountain. Yard by yard, puff by puff, the breeze hauled the figure through the blue flowers, over the boulders and red stones, till it lay huddled among the shattered rocks of the mountain top. Here the breeze was fitful, and allowed the strings of the parachute to tangle and festoon, and the figure sat, its helmeted head between its knees, held by a complication of lines. When the breeze blew, the lines would strain taut, and some accident of this pull lifted the head and chest upright, so that the figure seemed to peer across the brow of the mountain. Then, each time the wind dropped, the lines would slacken, and the figure bow forward again, sinking its head between its knees. So as the stars moved across the sky, the figure sat on the mountain top, and bowed, and sank, and bowed again. In the darkness of early morning there were noises by a rock a little way down the side of the mountain. 2 boys rolled out of a pile of brushwood and dead leaves, 2 dim shadows, talking sleepily to each other. They were the twins, on duty at the fire. In theory, one should have been asleep and one on watch, but they could never manage to do things sensibly, if that meant acting independently, and since staying awake all night was impossible, they had both gone to sleep. Now they approached the darker smudge that had been the signal fire, yawning, rubbing their eyes, treading with practised feet. When they reached it, they stopped yawning, and one ran quickly back for brushwood and leaves. The other knelt down. "I believe it's out." He fiddled with the sticks that were pushed into his hands. "No." He lay down and put his lips close to the smudge and blew softly. His face appeared lit redly. He stopped blowing for a moment. "Sam, give us tinderwood." Eric bent down and blew softly again till the patch was bright. Sam poked the piece of tinderwood into the hot spot, then a branch. The glow increased, and the branch took fire. Sam piled on more branches. "Don't burn the lot," said Eric. "You're putting on too much. Let's warm up. We'll only have to fetch more wood." "I'm cold." "So am I. Besides, it's dark. All right, then." Eric squatted back and watched Sam make up the fire. He built a little tent of dead wood, and the fire was safely alight. "That was near. He'd have been waxy." For a few moments the twins watched the fire in silence. Then Eric sniggered. "Wasn't he waxy? About the fire and the pig. Lucky he went for Jack instead of us. Remember old Waxy at school? Boy, you are driving me slowly insane." The twins shared their identical laughter, then remembered the darkness and other things, and glanced round uneasily. The flames, busy about the tent, drew their eyes back again. Eric watched the scurrying woodlice that were so frantically unable to avoid the flames, and thought of the first fire, just down there on the steeper side of the mountain, where now was complete darkness. He did not like to remember it, and looked away at the mountain top. Warmth radiated now, and beat pleasantly on them. Sam amused himself by fitting branches into the fire as closely as possible. Eric spread out his hands, searching for the distance at which the heat was just bearable. Idly looking beyond the fire, he resettled the scattered rocks from their flat shadows into daylight contours. Just there was the big rock, and the 3 stones there, that split rock, and there beyond was a gap, just there. "Sam? Huh?" "Nothing." The flames were mastering the branches. The bark was curling and falling away, the wood exploding. The tent fell inwards and flung a wide circle of light over the mountain top. "Sam, Huh? Sam! Sam! Sam looked at Eric irritably. The intensity of Eric's gaze made the direction in which he looked terrible, for Sam had his back to it. He scrambled round the fire, squatted by Eric, and looked to see. They became motionless, gripped in each other's arms, 4 unwinking eyes aimed, and 2 mouths open. Far beneath them the trees of the forest sighed, then roared. The hair on their foreheads fluttered, and flames blew out sideways from the fire. 15 yards away from them came the plopping noise of fabric blown open. Neither of the boys screamed, but the grip of their arms tightened, and their mouths grew peaked. For perhaps 10 seconds they crouched like that, while the flailing fire sent smoke and sparks and waves of inconstant light over the top of the mountain. Then, as though they had but one terrified mind between them, they scrambled away over the rocks and fled. Ralph was dreaming. He had fallen asleep after what seemed hours of tossing and turning noisily among the dry leaves. Even the sounds of nightmare from the other shelters no longer reached him, for he was back from where he came from, feeding the ponies with sugar over the garden wall. Then someone was shaking his arm, telling him that it was time for tea.
"Ralph, wake up!"
The leaves were roaring like the sea.
"Ralph, wake up!"
"What's the matter?"
"We saw the beast. Plain."
Who are you? The twins?"
"We saw the beast."
"Quiet. Piggy." The leaves were roaring still. Piggy bumped into him, and a twin grabbed him as he made for the oblong of paling stars.
"You can't go out. It's horrible."
"Piggy, where are the spears?"
"I can hear the—"
"Quiet, then. Lie still." They lay there listening, at first with doubt, but then with terror, to the description the twins breathed at them between bouts of extreme silence. Soon the darkness was full of claws, full of the awful unknown and menace. An interminable dawn faded the stars out, and at last light, sad and grey, filtered into the shelter. They began to stir, though still the world outside the shelter was impossibly dangerous. The maze of the darkness sorted into near and far, and at the high point of the sky the cloudlets were warmed with colour. A single seabird flapped upwards with a hoarse cry that was echoed presently, and something squawked in the forest. Now streaks of cloud near the horizon began to glow rosily, and the feathery tops of the palm were green. Ralph knelt in the entrance to the shelter and peered cautiously round him. "Sam and Eric, call them to an assembly. Quietly. Go on." The twins, holding tremulously to each other, dared the few yards to the next shelter, and spread the dreadful news. Ralph stood up and walked, for the sake of dignity, though with his back pricking, to the platform. Piggy and Simon followed him, and the other boys came sneaking after. Ralph took the conch from where it lay on the polished seat and held it to his lips. But then he hesitated and did not blow. He held the shell up instead and showed it to them, and they understood. The rays of the sun that were fanning upwards from below the horizon swung downwards to eye level. Ralph looked for a moment at the growing slice of gold that lit them from the right hand, and seemed to make speech possible. The circle of boys before him bristled with hunting spears. He handed the conch to Eric, the nearest of the twins.
"We've seen the beast with our own eyes." "No, we weren't asleep."
Sam took up the story. By custom now, one conch did for both twins, for their substantial unity was recognized.
"It was furry. There was something moving behind its head. Wings. The beast moved, too. That was awful. It kind of sat up. The fire was bright. We'd just made it up. More sticks on. There were eyes, teeth, claws. We ran as fast as we could, bashed into things. The beast followed us. I saw it slinking behind the trees. Nearly touched me."
Ralph pointed fearfully at Eric's face, which was striped with scars where the bushes had torn him.
"How did you do that?"
Eric felt his face.
"I'm all rough. Am I bleeding?"
The circle of boys shrank away in horror. Johnny, yawning still, burst into noisy tears and was slapped by Bill till he choked on them. The bright morning was full of threats, and the circle began to change. It faced out rather than in, and the spears of sharpened wood were like a fence. Jack called them back to the centre. "This'll be a real hunt. Who'll come?" Ralph moved impatiently.
"These spears are made of wood, don't be silly."
Jack sneered at him. "Frightened?"
"Of course I'm frightened. Who wouldn't be?"
He turned to the twins, yearning but hopeless.
"I suppose you aren't pulling our legs?"
The reply was too emphatic for anyone to doubt them. Piggy took the conch.
"Couldn't we kind of stay here? Maybe the beast won't come near us."
But for the sense of something watching them, Ralph would have shouted at him. "Stay here? And be cramped into this bit of the island, always on the lookout? How should we get our food? And what about the fire?" "Let's be moving," said Jack restlessly. "We're wasting time." "No, we're not. What about the little uns?" "Sucks to the little uns. Someone's got to look after them. Nobody has so far." "There was no need. Now there is. Piggy'll look after them." "That's right. Keep Piggy out of danger. Have some sense. What can Piggy do with only one eye?" The rest of the boys were looking from Jack to Ralph curiously. "And another thing. You can't have an ordinary hunt because the beast doesn't leave tracks. If it did, you'd have seen them. For all we know, the beast may swing through the trees like what's-its-name." They nodded. "So we've got to think." Piggy took off his damaged glasses and cleaned the remaining lens. "How about us, Ralph?" "You haven't got the conch. Here." "I mean, how about us? Suppose the beast comes when you're all away. I can't see proper, and if I get scared—" Jack broke in contemptuously. "You're always scared. I got the conch." "Conch! Conch!" shouted Jack. "We don't need the conch any more. We know who ought to say things. What good did Simon do speaking, or Bill, or Walter? It's time some people knew they've got to keep quiet and leave deciding things to the rest of us." Ralph could no longer ignore his speech. The blood was hot in his cheeks. "You haven't got the conch," he said. "Sit down." Jack's face went so white that the freckles showed as clear brown flecks. He licked his lips and remained standing. "This is a hunter's job." The rest of the boys watched intently. Piggy, finding himself uncomfortably embroiled, slid the conch to Ralph's knees and sat down. The silence grew oppressive, and Piggy held his breath. "This is more than a hunter's job," said Ralph at last, "because you can't track the beast. And don't you want to be rescued?" He turned to the assembly. "Don't you all want to be rescued?" He looked back at Jack. "I said before, the fire is the main thing. Now the fire must be out." The old exasperation saved him and gave him the energy to attack. "Hasn't anyone got any sense? We've got to relight that fire. You never thought of that, Jack, did you? Or don't any of you want to be rescued?" Yes, they wanted to be rescued. There was no doubt about that. And with a violent swing to Ralph's side, the crisis passed. Piggy let out his breath with a gasp, reached for it again, and failed. He lay against a log, his mouth gaping, blue shadows creeping round his lips. Nobody minded him. "Now think, Jack. Is there anywhere on the island you haven't been?" Unwillingly, Jack answered. "There's only— But of course. You remember the tail-end part where the rocks are all piled up? I've been near there. The rock makes a sort of bridge. There's only one way up. And the thing might live there." All the assembly talked at once. "Quiet! All right. That's where we'll look. If the beast isn't there, we'll go up the mountain and look, and light the fire. Let's go. We'll eat first, then go." Ralph paused. "We'd better take spears." End of Disc 3. Lord of the Flies, Disc 4. After they had eaten, Ralph and the big uns set out along the beach. They left Piggy propped up on the platform. This day promised, like the others, to be a sunbath under a blue dome. The beach stretched away before them in a gentle curve, till perspective drew it into one with the forest. For the day was not advanced enough to be obscured by the shifting veils of mirage. Under Ralph's direction they picked a careful way along the palm terrace, rather than dare the hot sand down by the water. He let Jack lead the way, and Jack trod with theatrical caution, though they could have seen an enemy 20 yards away. Ralph walked in the rear, thankful to have escaped responsibility for a time. Simon, walking in front of Ralph, felt a flicker of incredulity. A beast with claws that scratched, that sat on a mountain-top, that left no tracks, and yet was not fast enough to catch Sam Nerrick. However Simon thought of the beast, there rose before his inward sight the picture of a human, at once heroic and sick. He sighed. Other people could stand up and speak to an assembly, apparently, without that dreadful feeling of the pressure of personality, could say what they would, as though they were speaking to only one person. He stepped aside and looked back. Ralph was coming along holding his spear over his shoulder. Diffidently Simon allowed his pace to slacken, until he was walking side by side with Ralph, and looking up at him through the coarse black hair that fell now to his eyes. Ralph glanced sideways, smiled constrainedly as though he had forgotten that Simon had made a fool of himself, then looked away again, at nothing. For a moment or two Simon was happy to be accepted, and then he ceased to think about himself. When he bashed into a tree, Ralph looked sideways impatiently, and Robert sniggered. Simon reeled, and a white spot on his forehead turned red and trickled. Ralph dismissed Simon, and returned to his personal hell. They would reach the castle sometime, and the chief would have to go forward. Jack came trotting back. "We're in sight now." "All right. We'll get as close as we can." He followed Jack towards the castle, where the ground rose slightly. On their left was an impenetrable tangle of creepers and trees. "Why couldn't there be something in that?" "Because you can see, nothing goes in or out." "What about the castle, then?" "Look." Ralph parted the screen of grass and looked out. There were only a few more yards of stony ground, and then the two sides of the island came almost together, so that one expected a peak of headland. But instead of this, a narrow ledge of rock a few yards wide and perhaps 15 long continued the island out into the sea. There lay another of those pieces of pink squareness that underlay the structure of the island. This side of the castle, perhaps 100 feet high, was the pink bastion they had seen from the mountain-top. The rock of the cliff was split, and the top littered with great lumps that seemed to totter. Behind Ralph, the tall grass had filled with silent hunters. Ralph looked at Jack. "You're a hunter." Jack went red. "I know. All right." Something deep in Ralph spoke for him. "I'm chief. I'll go. Don't argue." He turned to the others. "You, hide here. Wait for me." He found his voice tended either to disappear or to come out too loud. He looked at Jack. "Do you think—" Jack muttered, "I've been all over. It must be here." "I see." Simon mumbled confusedly, "I don't believe in the beast." Ralph answered him politely, as if agreeing about the weather. "No, I suppose not." His mouth was tight and pale. He put back his hair very slowly. "Well, so long." He forced his feet to move until they had carried him out onto the neck of land. He was surrounded on all sides by chasms of empty air. There was nowhere to hide, even if one did not have to go on. He paused on the narrow neck and looked down. Soon, in a matter of centuries, the sea would make an island of the castle. On the right hand was the lagoon, troubled by the open sea. And on the left, Ralph shuddered. The lagoon had protected them from the Pacific, and for some reason only Jack had gone right down to the water on the other side. Now he saw the landsman's view of the swell, and it seemed like the breathing of some stupendous creature. Slowly the waters sank among the rocks, revealing pink tables of granite, strange growths of coral, polyp, and weed. Down, down the waters went, whispering like the wind among the heads of the forest. There was one flat rock there, spread like a table, and the waters, sucking down on the four weedy sides, made them seem like cliffs. Then the sleeping Leviathan breathed out. The waters rose, the weed streamed, and the water boiled over the table rock with a roar. There was no sense of the passage of waves, only this minute-long fall and rise and fall. Ralph turned away to the red cliff. They were waiting behind him in the long grass, waiting to see what he would do. He noticed that the sweat in his palm was cool now, realized with surprise that he did not really expect to meet any beast, and didn't know what he would do about it if he did. He saw that he could climb the cliff, but this was not necessary. The squareness of the rock allowed a sort of plinth round it, so that to the right, over the lagoon, one could inch along a ledge and turn round the corner out of sight. It was easy going, and soon he was peering round the rock. Nothing but what you might expect, pink tumbled boulders with guano layered on them like icing, and a steep slope up to the shattered rocks that crowned the bastion. A sound behind him made him turn. Jack was edging along the ledge.
"Couldn't let you do it on your own."
Ralph said nothing. He led the way over the rocks, inspected a sort of half-cave that held nothing more terrible than a clutch of rotten eggs, and at last sat down, looking round him and tapping the rock with the butt of his spear. Jack was excited.
"What a place for a fort!"
A column of spray wetted them. No fresh water.
"Oh, what's that, then?"
There was indeed a long green smudge halfway up the rock. They climbed up and tasted the trickle of water.
"You could keep a coconut shell there, filling all the time."
"Not me. This is a rotten place." Side by side they scaled the last height to where the diminishing pile was crowned by the last broken rock. Jack struck the near one with his fist, and it grated slightly.
"Do you remember?"
Consciousness of the bad times in between came to them both. Jack talked quickly.
"Shove a palm tree under that, and if an enemy came, look!"
100 feet below them was the narrow causeway, then the stony ground, then the grass dotted with heads, and behind that the forest.
"One heave!" cried Jack, exulting. "And whee!"
He made a swooping movement with his hand. Ralph looked towards the mountain.
"What's the matter?"
Ralph turned. "Why?"
"You were looking... I don't know how."
"There's no signal now. Nothing to show."
"You're nuts on the signal."
The taut blue horizon encircled them, broken only by the mountain top. "That's all we've got." He leaned his spear against the rocking stone and pushed back 2 handfuls of hair. "We'll have to go back and climb the mountain. That's where they saw the beast."
"The beast won't be there."
"What else can we do?" The others, waiting in the grass, saw Jack and Ralph unharmed and broke cover into the sunlight. They forgot the beast in the excitement of exploration. They swarmed across the bridge and soon were climbing and shouting. Ralph stood now, one hand against an enormous red block, a block large as a mill wheel that had been split off and hung tottering. Somberly he watched the mountain. He clenched his fist and beat hammer-wise on the red wall at his right. His lips were tightly compressed, and his eyes yearned beneath the fringe of hair. "Smoke!" He sucked his bruised fist. "Jack, come on!" But Jack was not there. A knot of boys making a great noise that he had not noticed were heaving and pushing at a rock. As he turned, the base cracked, and the whole mass toppled into the sea, so that a thunderous plume of spray leapt halfway up the cliff. "Stop it! Stop it!" His voice struck a silence among them. Smoke. A strange thing happened in his head. Something flitted there in front of his mind like a bat's wing, obscuring his idea. Smoke! At once the ideas were back, and the anger. "We want smoke, and you go wasting your time! You roll rocks!" Roger shouted, "We've got plenty of time." Ralph shook his head. "We'll go to the mountain." The clamour broke out. Some of the boys wanted to go back to the beach, some wanted to roll more rocks. The sun was bright, and danger had faded with the darkness. "Jack, the beast might be on the other side. You can lead again. You've been. We could go by the shore. There's fruit." Bill came up to Ralph. "Why can't we stay here for a bit?" "That's right. Let's have a fort." "There's no food here," said Ralph, "and no shelter. Not much fresh water." "This would make a wizard fort. We can roll rocks right onto the bridge." "I say we'll go on," shouted Ralph furiously. "We've got to make certain. We'll go now." "Let's stay here. Back to the shelter. I'm tired." "No!" Ralph struck the skin off his knuckles. They did not seem to hurt. "I'm chief. We've got to make certain. Can't you see the mountain? There's no signal showing. There may be a ship out there. Are you all off your rockers?" Mutinously the boys fell silent, or muttering. Jack led the way down the rock and across the bridge. Chapter 7. Shadows and Tall Trees. The pig run kept close to the jumble of rocks that lay down by the water on the other side, and Ralph was content to follow Jack along it. If you could shut your ears to the slow suck-down of the sea and boil of the return, if you could forget how dun and unvisited were the ferny coverts on either side, then there was a chance that you might put the beast out of mind and dream for a while. The sun had swung over the vertical, and the afternoon heat was closing in on the island. Ralph passed a message forward to Jack, and when they next came to fruit, the whole party stopped and ate. Sitting, Ralph was aware of the heat for the first time that day. He pulled distastefully at his grey shirt, and wondered whether he might undertake the adventure of washing it. Sitting under what seemed an unusual heat even for this island, Ralph planned his toilet. He would like to have a pair of scissors and cut this hair. He flung the mass back. Cut this filthy hair right back to half an inch. He would like to have a bath, a proper wallow with soap. He passed his tongue experimentally over his teeth and decided that a toothbrush would come in handy too. Then there were his nails. Ralph turned his hand over and examined them. They were bitten down to the quick, though he could not remember when he had restarted this habit, nor any time when he indulged it. "Be sucking my thumb next." He looked round furtively. Apparently no one had heard. The hunters sat stuffing themselves with this easy meal, trying to convince themselves that they got sufficient kick out of bananas and that other olive-grey, jelly-like fruit. With the memory of his sometime clean self as a standard, Ralph looked them over. They were dirty, not with the spectacular dirt of boys who had fallen into mud or been brought down hard on a rainy day. Not one of them was an obvious subject for a shower, and yet hair much too long, tangled here and there, knotted round a dead leaf or a twig, faces cleaned fairly well by the process of eating and sweating, but marked in the less accessible angles with a kind of shadow. Clothes worn away, stiff like his own with sweat, put on not for decorum or comfort, but out of custom. The skin of the body scurfy with brine. He discovered, with a little fall of the heart, that these were the conditions he took as normal now, and that he did not mind. He sighed, and pushed away the stalk from which he had stripped the fruit. Already the hunters were stealing away to do their business in the woods or down by the rocks. He turned and looked out to sea. Here, on the other side of the island, the view was utterly different. The filmy enchantments of mirage could not endure the cold ocean water, and the horizon was hard, clipped blue. Ralph wandered down to the rocks. Down here, almost on a level with the sea, you could follow with your eye the ceaseless bulging passage of the deep-sea waves. They were miles wide, apparently not breakers or the banked ridges of shallow water. They travelled the length of the island with an air of disregarding it and being set on other business. They were less a progress than a momentous rise and fall of the whole ocean. Now the sea would suck down, making cascades and waterfalls of retreating water, would sink past the rocks and plaster down the seaweed like shining hair, then, pausing, gather and rise with a roar, irresistibly swelling over point and outcrop, climbing the little cliff, sending, at last, an arm of surf up a gully, to end a yard or so from him, in fingers of spray. Wave after wave, Ralph followed the rise and fall, until something of the remoteness of the sea numbed his brain. Then, gradually, the almost infinite size of this land forced itself on his attention. This was the divider, the barrier. On the other side of the island, swathed at midday with mirage, defended by the shield of the quiet lagoon, one might dream of rescue. But here, faced by the brute obtuseness of the ocean, the miles of division, one was clamped down, one was helpless, one was condemned, one was— Simon was speaking almost in his ear. Ralph found that he had rock painfully gripped in both hands, found his body arched, the muscles of his neck stiff, his mouth strained open. "You'll get back to where you came from." Simon nodded as he spoke. He was kneeling on one knee, looking down from a higher rock, which he held with both hands. His other leg stretched down to Ralph's level. Ralph was puzzled, and searched Simon's face for a clue. "It's so big. I mean—" Simon nodded. "All the same, you'll get back all right. I think so, anyway." Some of the strain had gone from Ralph's body. He glanced at the sea, and then smiled bitterly at Simon. "Got a ship in your pocket?" Simon grinned and shook his head. "How do you know, then?" When Simon was still silent, Ralph said curtly, "You're batty." Simon shook his head violently, till the coarse black hair flew backwards and forwards across his face. "No, I'm not. I just think you'll get back all right." For a moment nothing more was said, and then they suddenly smiled at each other. Roger called from the coverts, "Come and see!" The ground was turned over near the pig run, and there were droppings that steamed. Jack bent down to them, as though he loved them. "Ralph, we need meat, even if we are hunting the other thing." "If you mean going the right way, we'll hunt." They set off again, the hunters bunched a little by fear of the mentioned beast, while Jack quested ahead. They went more slowly than Ralph had bargained for. Yet in a way he was glad to loiter, cradling his spear. Jack came up against some emergency of his craft, and soon the procession stopped. Ralph leaned against a tree, and at once the daydreams came swarming up. Jack was in charge of the hunt, and there would be time to get to the mountain. Once, following his father from Chatham to Devonport, they had lived in a cottage on the edge of the moors. In the succession of houses that Ralph had known, this one stood out with particular clarity, because after that house he had been sent away to school. Mummy had still been with them, and Daddy had come home every day. Wild ponies came to the stone wall at the bottom of the garden, and it had snowed. Just behind the cottage there was a sort of shed, and you could lie up there watching the flakes swirl past. You could see the damp spot where each flake died. Then you could mark the first flake that lay down without melting, and watch the whole ground turn white. You could go indoors when you were cold, and look out of the window, past that bright copper kettle, and the plate with the little blue men. When you went to bed, there was a bowl of cornflakes with sugar and cream. And the books. They stood on the shelf by the bed, leaning together, with always 2 or 3 laid flat on top because he had not bothered to put them back properly. They were dog-eared and scratched. There was the bright, shining one about Topsy and Mopsy that he never read because it was about 2 girls. There was the one about the magician, which you read with a kind of tied-down terror, skipping page 27 with the awful picture of the spider. There was a book about people who had dug things up, Egyptian things. There was the boy's book of trains, the boy's book of ships. Vividly they came before him. He could have reached up and touched them, could feel the weight and slow slide with which the mammoth book for boys would come out and slither down. Everything was all right. Everything was good-humoured and friendly. The bushes crashed ahead of them. Boys flung themselves wildly from the pig track and scrabbled in the creepers, screaming. Ralph saw Jack nudged aside and fall. Then there was a creature bounding along the pig track towards him, with tusks gleaming and an intimidating grunt. Ralph found he was able to measure the distance coldly and take aim. With the boar only 5 yards away, he flung the foolish wooden stick that he carried, saw it hit the great snout, and hang there for a moment. The boar's note changed to a squeal, and it swerved aside into the covert. The pig run filled with shouting boys again. Jack came running back and poked about in the undergrowth. "Through here!" "But he'd do us!" "Through here, I said!" The boar was floundering away from them. They found another pig run parallel to the first, and Jack raced away. Ralph was full of fright and apprehension and pride. "I hit him. The spear stuck in." Now they came unexpectedly to an open space by the sea. Jack cast about on the bare rock and looked anxious. "He's gone." "I hit him," said Ralph again, "and the spear stuck in a bit." He felt the need of witnesses. "Didn't you see me?" Morris nodded. "I saw you. Right bang on his snout. Whee!" Ralph talked on excitedly. "I hit him all right. The spear stuck in. I wounded him." He sunned himself in their new respect, and felt that hunting was good, after all. "I walloped him properly. That was the beast, I think." Jack came back. "That wasn't the beast. That was a boar. I hit him." "Why didn't you grab him? I tried—" Ralph's voice ran up. "But a boar!" Jack flushed suddenly. "You said he'd do us. What did you want to throw for? Why didn't you wait?" He held out his arm. "Look." He turned his left forearm for them all to see. On the outside was a rip. Not much, but bloody. "He did that with his tusks. I couldn't get my spear down in time." Attention focused on Jack. "That's a wound," said Simon, "and you ought to suck it, like Berengaria." Jack sucked. "I hit him," said Ralph indignantly. "I hit him with my spear. I wounded him." He tried for their attention. He was coming along the path. "I threw like this." Robert snarled at him. Ralph entered into the play, and everybody laughed. Presently they were all jabbing at Robert, who made mock rushes. Jack shouted, "Make a ring!" The circle moved in and round. Robert squealed in mock terror, then in real pain. "Ow! Stop it! You're hurting!" The butt end of a spear fell on his back, and he blundered among them. "Hold him!" They got his arms and legs. Ralph, carried away by a sudden thick excitement, grabbed Eric's spear and jabbed at Robert with it. "Kill him! Kill him!" All at once, Robert was screaming and struggling with the strength of frenzy. Jack had him by the hair and was brandishing his knife. Behind him was Roger, fighting to get close. The chant rose ritually, as the last moment of a dance or a hunt. "Kill the pig! Cut his throat! Kill the pig! Bash him in!" Ralph, too, was fighting to get near, to get a handful of that brown, vulnerable flesh. The desire to squeeze and hurt was overmastering. Jack's arm came down. The heaving circle cheered and made pig-dying noises. Then they lay quiet, panting, listening to Robert's frightened snivels. He wiped his face with a dirty arm and made an effort to retrieve his status. "Oh, my bum!" He rubbed his rump ruefully. Jack rolled over. "That was a good game." "Just a game," said Ralph uneasily. "I got jolly badly hurt at rugger once." "We ought to have a drum," said Morris. "Then we could do it properly." Ralph looked at him. "How properly?" "I don't know. You want a fire, I think, and a drum, and you keep time to the drum." "You want a pig," said Roger, "like a real hunt." "Or someone to pretend," said Jack. "You could get someone to dress up as a pig, and then he could act, pretend to knock me over and all that." "You want a real pig," said Robert, still caressing his rump, "because you've got to kill him." "Use a little un," said Jack, and everybody laughed. Ralph sat up. "Well, we shan't find what we're looking for at this rate." One by one they stood up, twitching rags into place. Ralph looked at Jack. "Now for the mountain." "Shouldn't we go back to Piggy?" said Morris, "before dark?" The twins nodded like one boy. "Yes, that's right. Let's go up there in the morning." Ralph looked out and saw the sea. "We've got to start the fire again." "You haven't got Piggy's specs," said Jack, "so you can't." "Then we'll find out if the mountain's clear." Morris spoke, hesitating, not wanting to seem a funk. "Supposing the beast's up there?" Jack brandished his spear. "We'll kill it." The sun seemed a little cooler. He slashed with the spear. "What are we waiting for?" "I suppose," said Ralph, "if we keep on by the sea this way, we'll come out below the burnt bit, and then we can climb the mountain." Once more Jack led them along by the sark and heave of the blinding sea. Once more Ralph dreamed, letting his skilful feet deal with the difficulties of the path. Yet here his feet seemed less skilful than before. For most of the way they were forced right down to the bare rock by the water, and had to edge along between that and the dark luxuriance of the forest. There were little cliffs to be scaled, some to be used as paths, lengthy traverses, where one used hands as well as feet. Here and there they could clamber over wave-wet rock, leaping across clear pools that the tide had left. They came to a gully that split the narrow foreshore like a defence. This seemed to have no bottom, and they peered awe-stricken into the gloomy crack where water gurgled. Then the wave came back, the gully boiled before them, and spray dashed up to the very creeper, so that the boys were wet and shrieking. They tried the forest, but it was thick and woven like a bird's nest. In the end they had to jump one by one, waiting till the water sank, and even so some of them got a second drenching. After that the rocks seemed to be growing impossible, so they sat for a time, letting their rags dry, and watching the clipped outlines of the rollers that moved so slowly past the island. They found fruit in a haunt of bright little birds that hovered like insects. Then Ralph said they were going too slowly. He himself climbed a tree and parted the canopy, and saw the square head of the mountain seeming still a great way off. Then they tried to hurry along the rocks, and Robert cut his knee quite badly, and they had to recognize that this path must be taken slowly if they were to be safe. So they proceeded after that as if they were climbing a dangerous mountain, until the rocks became an uncompromising cliff, overhung with impossible jungle, and falling sheer into the sea. Ralph looked at the sun critically. Early evening, after tea-time at any rate. "I don't remember this cliff," said Jack, crestfallen. "So this must be the bit of the coast I missed." Ralph nodded. "Let me think." By now Ralph had no self-consciousness in public thinking, but would treat the day's decisions as though he were playing chess. The only trouble was that he would never be a very good chess player. He thought of the little ones and Piggy. Vividly he imagined Piggy by himself, huddled in a shelter that was silent, except for the sounds of nightmare. "We can't leave the little ones alone with Piggy. Not all night." The other boys said nothing but stood round, watching him. "If we went back, we should take ours." Jack cleared his throat and spoke in a queer, tight voice. "We mustn't let anything happen to Piggy, must we?" Ralph tapped his teeth with the dirty point of Eric's spear. "If we go across—" He glanced round him. "Someone's got to cross the island and tell Piggy we'll be back after dark." Bill spoke, unbelieving. "Through the forest by himself? Now? We can't spare more than one." Simon pushed his way to Ralph's elbow. "I'll go, if you like. I don't mind, honestly." Before Ralph had time to reply, he smiled quickly, turned, and climbed into the forest. Ralph looked back at Jack, seeing him, infuriatingly, for the first time. "Jack, that time you went the whole way to the Castle Rock?" Jack glowered. "Yes." "You came along part of this shore, below the mountain, beyond there?" "Yes." "And then?" "I found a pig run. It went for miles." Ralph nodded. He pointed at the forest. "So the pig run must be somewhere in there." Everybody agreed, sagely. "All right, then. We'll smash a way through till we find the pig run." He took a step and halted. "Wait a minute, though. Where does the pig run go to?" "The mountain," said Jack. "I told you." He sneered. "Don't you want to go to the mountain?" Ralph sighed, sensing the rising antagonism, understanding that this was how Jack felt as soon as he ceased to lead. "I was thinking of the light. We'll be stumbling about." "We were going to look for the beast." "There won't be enough light." "I don't mind going," said Jack hotly. "I'll go when we get there. Won't you? Would you rather go back to the shelters and tell Piggy?" Now it was Ralph's turn to flush, but he spoke despairingly, out of the new understanding that Piggy had given him. "Why do you hate me?" The boys stirred uneasily, as though something indecent had been said. The silence lengthened. Ralph, still hot and hurt, turned away first. "Come on." He led the way, and set himself, as by right, to hack at the tangles. Jack brought up the rear, displaced and brooding. The pig track was a dark tunnel, for the sun was sliding quickly towards the edge of the world, and in the forest shadows were never far to seek. The track was broad and beaten, and they ran along at a swift trot. Then the roof of leaves broke up, and they halted, breathing quickly, looking at the few stars that pricked round the head of the mountain. "There you are." The boys peered at each other doubtfully. Ralph made a decision. "We'll go straight across to the platform and climb tomorrow." They murmured agreement, but Jack was standing by his shoulder. "If you're frightened, of course." Ralph turned on him. "Who went first on the Castle Rock?" "I went too, and that was daylight." "All right. Who wants to climb the mountain now?" Silence was the only answer. "Sam Merrick, what about you?" "We ought to go and tell Piggy. Yes, tell Piggy that—" "But Simon went." "We ought to tell Piggy in case—" "Robert? Bill?" They were going straight back to the platform now. Not, of course, that they were afraid, but tired. Ralph turned back to Jack. "You see? I'm going up the mountain." The words came from Jack viciously, as though they were a curse. He looked at Ralph, his thin body tensed, his spear held as if he threatened him. "I'm going up the mountain to look for the beast. Now." Then the supreme sting, the casual, bitter word. "Coming." At that word, the other boys forgot their urge to be gone, and turned back to sample this fresh rub of two spirits in the dark. The word was too good, too bitter, too successfully daunting to be repeated. It took Ralph at low water, when his nerve was relaxed for the return to the shelter and the still friendly waters of the lagoon. "I don't mind." Astonished, he heard his voice come out, cool and casual, so that the bitterness of Jack's taunt fell powerless. "If you don't mind, of course."
"Oh, not at all."
Jack took a step.
"Well, then?"
Side by side, watched by silent boys, the two started up the mountain. Ralph stopped. "We're silly. Why should only two go? If we find anything, two won't be enough.